We have a whole analysis of vendors in the market in India where they basically take a loan every day to buy their produce. And these work very hard. It's very hard to call them procrastinators or myopic. They plan to work extremely hard, yet they were borrowing at 5% a day. And you could see that if they rearrange their loans and their payments, they could get debt-free in 3 days. They kept borrowing every day at 5%, and something looked very extreme there. And examples like that led us basically to what we now call the psychology of scarcity. And the general argument is that basically not having enough creates a particular psychology. It's being in a specific context that yields particular behaviors that are specific, that are endemic to not having enough. They're endemic to the psychology that comes with focusing on trying to make ends meet. So the argument is a personality trait. It's what happens to all of us when all of a sudden making ends meet becomes the focus of our being. Exactly. And then the next step, of course, we talk about the scarcity trap, which is, once you end up there, it's often very hard to get out because now you owe the interest. Right. You're poorer next month. No need to explain this to you, but now things get a lot worse. And so it's the moment that gets you into the trap that makes it hard to exit. And of course, the corollary, the implication of all this is that people like us, like you, if this is the story, then there's a real role to play, because if you do the right things to diminish the stress of scarcity, you can really make a big difference. Again, it's not the person who is at fault, it's the moment of scarcity that makes things so difficult. So we take, in many cases, Princeton undergraduates, we put them in a context in a laboratory where they play games against time. We make it in these games, they have the option to borrow extra seconds to complete a round now, for which they pay at the end with more extra seconds lost. In some conditions, they borrow at no interest. In other cases, they borrow at high interest. So every extra second the player uses, they get 2 seconds less at the end of the game. That's kind of predatory lending, if you will. These kids, they play and they have enough time to think clearly and not be stressed about time. They borrow very thoughtfully. When they get time poor, when they really need the few extra seconds, they get quite desensitized to the interest rate that incurs on these lendings. And what they do is basically they hurt their performance. So if you compare the group that can borrow to the group that cannot borrow, doesn't hurt the rich. It really hurts the poor. Phenomena we've kind of trying to create in a lab, basically arguing scarcity leads you, among other things, to borrow in ways that are not insightful, but that we can show the same person would do much better had they just been a little bit less poor. So the argument now is that when you deal with scarcity, the tendency to overborrow and to be myopic is one of the features. Another one is that you're just doing less well in divided attention and cognitive control. You're just functioning as less impressive as a person. And less well, your fluid intelligence is significantly lowered. In some metrics, it compares to roughly 12 points on the IQ scale, which is, a qualitatively different level. So what we do now in India is we take the same farmer who does sugarcane, and because harvest is only once a year, and it's very hard for them to smooth their consumption, these are farmers who end up being basically relatively poor before the harvest and relatively rich after. So we now run the same person 4 months apart, before and after harvest, on the same tests. And again, we show that this farmer looks about 10 IQ points less intelligent under scarcity before harvest and after. We need a whole renewed awareness of the challenges that come with living under scarcity. And what that means is that your bandwidth, your ability to attend to things is severely tried, is severely diminished, and whatever I can do to diminish that, to help you on that, can make a big difference. We tend to be very blind to all that. If you take somebody like that, the last thing you want to do is impose more demands on them of the kind that require cognitive control and attention. So any financial institution, any policymaker needs to be super aware, what can I do to facilitate those issues? It could be giving the payments, weekly rather than monthly. That might facilitate to some extent your management of everyday scarcity. It could be forms. It could be defaulting you into the right thing as opposed to requiring you to remember to apply and do it. The general microfinance pride in being very rigid.
Right.
The question here, I mean, is your job to educate the person or to help them deal with their bandwidth? Mm-hmm. If it's, it may very well be that being flexible and giving me 2 extra days can make a big difference. You don't send me to take another loan because I'm late on this one. It could really alter a bit how beneficial we think it is to be rigid if we take seriously the difficulties you have in dealing with scarcity as opposed to, negligence or personality issues or other things that we might think are causing you to be late. The fact that the client chooses to pay, again, I think it sounds, very, very, very supportive. And then the question is what the wisdom of that is. It's a complicated story. The idea of being less rigid, all else equal, would be a useful thing for somebody who's doing all the right stuff and just having a very hard time managing. Absolutely. And, we use this term, we call it tunneling. So the idea is that you focus on your scarcity and focus on a bad thing. And we showed that when you focus, you actually do very well. So, in some sense, when you have a deadline and you do nothing else that day, pretty good work on that deadline.
Right.
The problem is you're neglecting a lot of other things. Tunneling is going to let you do things that are not always extremely far-sighted. Basically, come to the guy when he's rich, when he has abundance post-harvest, and say, why don't you now buy the fertilizer you need for when the next harvest comes? And that forward planning, buying in advance while you still have money, allows you to smooth your year much better than it was before. This is somebody, do they experience scarcity or not? Well, half the year not, half the year yes, and helping them to smooth it could make things a lot more comfortable. But yes, if you're a well-intentioned lender, there is a real possibility the person who's coming for the loan is in a situation where it's not that they don't have enough money, it's they don't have enough money now.
Right.
And they rearrange things differently. They might have been able to afford it, and taking this loan might put them in a trap that may be very hard to come out of. Or, for example, if the interest I charged you was such that half of it went into your savings account, so that after you took 8 loans, given that I made you pay some of it into savings, you now have enough to borrow the next time on your own, from your own money. There are ways to arrange all that might help you in the long run. Because the intent here is not that you're permanently poor, is that you need the money right now, and either I help you get back to where you could be, or you're in a trap for a very long time. In the applied research, it's been shown in different places that certain identities carry with them traits as well as sometimes, for example, stereotype threat. And in that, basically, in a lot of the research that's shown, being an African-American kid in school in America brings with it a stereotype of being less good. Just relied on the research and told ourselves, well, if this kind of issue comes up with minorities, you certainly could imagine it coming up among the poor who carry around with them the stigma of poverty and a lot of research, the perceptibility, lack of trustworthiness, and all the stuff that comes with the perception of being poor. Creating offices like the ones where you work, in some sense, has a natural feature of making salient the fact that I'm a poor recipient of aid.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it's going to differ from place to place. The exact nature of these identities, the role they play, how they're perceived, would have to be tested very locally and wisely.
Right.
General idea is that, yes, the client, you, anybody else, carry with us multiple identities, as it were, and making one or the other salient could make a difference to how we perceive things, the willingness that we show in exploring or attempting something new or threatening, etc. we need to do pilot studies. We have to understand exactly what are the clients thinking, feeling, how do they perceive the issue, and given what we know and what we found about how they see things, how do we go about, ameliorating their conditions, making their decisions easier, etc. The idea to pose these policies without understanding the detail, I think that's history. I mean, it's very clear. It doesn't have to take psychologists. I think any good economist at this point would agree that you really have to, understand the nuances before you can do good solutions. The idea that you can just do a standard formula, I think, for many people is passé.